I'm a 19-year-old guy, and last year I got a full-ride scholarship to my state university. It pays for everything: tuition, books, housing, and even gives me some spending money. The scholarship was actually set up by my mom's dad, who was a professor at the same university for 40 years. He created it before he passed away when I was 15. My parents' relationship was always rocky. They split up when I was 14 and officially divorced when I was 15, not long after my grandpa died. My dad worked in construction and was often gone for weeks at a time for jobs. My mom was a receptionist at a doctor's office but got laid off when I was 11 and never found another job. Every time my dad came home, they'd fight about money. My mom would say we were barely scraping by, and my dad would snap back that he was working 60-hour weeks just to keep us afloat. I'd usually escape to my room and put on headphones to block out the yelling. When I started high school, I began staying late for study groups and club meetings, so I'd often get home after dinner. Sometimes my mom would leave me a plate of food in the microwave, but other times there'd be nothing. As their fights got worse, things at home felt more tense. One night, I came home to find my dad packing his clothes into a duffel bag. He walked right past me without saying a word and didn't come back for a week. When he did return, it was just to grab more of his stuff. He'd already moved into an apartment across town. The divorce dragged on for months. My dad's construction business was struggling, and my mom still didn't have a job. They fought over the house, the car, and what little savings they had. It didn't feel like either of them fought over me, though. During that time, I spent most weekends with my dad's mom, my grandma, who lived about 20 minutes away. She'd pick me up on Fridays and drop me off on Sundays. Sometimes when I got home, my mom would be sitting in the same spot on the couch as when I left 2 days earlier. Other times, she wouldn't even be there. After the divorce was finalized, my mom kept the house but had to get a job to cover the mortgage. She started working as a cashier at a grocery store. The hours were long, and the pay wasn't amazing, but it was enough to get by. My dad was supposed to pay child support, but his construction business was still struggling, so the payments were often late or didn't come at all. My grandma offered to let me live with her, but my mom said no. She insisted it looked better if I stayed with her, so I kept living in my childhood home, though I spent most weekends at my grandma's to get away. By the time I turned 17, things started to improve a little. My dad's business picked up, and he became more consistent with child support. My mom got promoted to assistant manager at the store, which eased some of her money stress. They even started talking again when my dad would drop off the child support checks instead of mailing them. Last year, I graduated high school and found out I'd won my grandfather's scholarship. It covered all my college costs for 4 years, as long as I kept a 3.5 GPA, and even included a small monthly stipend for living expenses. I wouldn't have to work during school and could focus entirely on my studies. I planned to major in engineering, the same field my grandfather had taught. The weekend after graduation, my parents invited me to dinner. I thought it was to celebrate my graduation and scholarship. But when I got to the restaurant, they were sitting together, holding hands. They told me they'd been dating again for the past 6 months and had decided to renew their vows. The ceremony was planned for my winter break during freshman year. I congratulated them and asked about their plans. That's when they dropped the bomb. They wanted me to help pay for it. Specifically, they wanted me to use part of my scholarship stipend to cover some of the costs. They said since my education was already paid for, I didn't really need the extra money. They'd already chosen a venue and caterer, and the whole thing would cost around $15,000. They wanted me to contribute $5,000 from my stipend over the next semester. I explained to them that the stipend was meant to cover my living costs while I was at university. My dad said I'd be staying in the dorms with a meal plan, so my expenses would be pretty low. My mom chimed in, saying they'd supported me for 18 years and now it was my turn to give back. I reminded them that my grandfather had set up the scholarship specifically for my education, and using it for anything else would go against his wishes. My dad brushed it off, saying my grandfather wouldn't care if a little bit went toward a family celebration. When I kept saying no, my mom got upset. She said I'd become selfish since getting the scholarship and acted like I was better than them now that I was going to college. My dad added that they'd sacrificed so much for me, and I couldn't even help them celebrate their reunion. I ended up leaving the restaurant and walking 2 miles back to my grandma's house, where I'd been staying since graduation. When I told her what happened, she just shook her head, not surprised. She said I could stay with her until I moved into the dorms. The next day, my parents called and texted me a bunch of times, but I didn't answer. My mom left a voicemail saying I was being childish and that we needed to talk like adults. My dad texted that I owed them after everything they'd done for me. A week later, My uncle invited the whole family to a barbecue at his place. I didn't want to go because I knew my parents would be there, but my grandma talked me into it, saying it was better to face them in a group setting than to avoid them altogether. At the barbecue, things seemed fine at first. My uncle was grilling, my cousins were playing volleyball, and my mom was chatting with her sister. My dad was helping with the grill. I stuck close to my grandma and talked with my cousins. During dinner, as everyone was sitting around the picnic tables, my mom cleared her throat and announced that she and my dad had picked a date for their vow renewal ceremony. Everyone clapped and congratulated them. Then, with a sharp look at me, she added that they were having budget issues because someone who'd recently come into money wouldn't help his own parents celebrate their love. The table went quiet. My grandma put her hand on my arm, but I moved it away and stood up. I explained to everyone that my mom was talking about my scholarship money, which was meant to cover my education and living costs while I was at university. My dad cut in, saying they weren't asking for the whole thing, just a small part of the stipend that I didn't really need. My uncle, who was really close to my grandfather, asked if they were talking about the scholarship fund my grandfather had set up. When my mom said yes, my uncle got really upset. He told them it was wrong to ask me to use that money for anything other than what my grandfather had intended. My mom argued that families should help each other out, and since my education was already taken care of, I should be willing to share some of my good fortune. My dad added that they weren't asking for much, just a little bit to help with their special day. That's when my grandma spoke up. She reminded them that they'd pretty much ignored me during their divorce and the years after. She also pointed out that neither of them had put any money toward my college fund, while my grandfather had worked hard to create the scholarship specifically for his grandkids' education. Things got heated after that. My parents accused my grandma and uncle of turning me against them, and other family members started picking sides. Eventually, my parents stormed out of the barbecue, with my mom yelling that I was ungrateful and would regret my decision. A week later, I got a message from my dad saying that if I didn't change my mind, I shouldn't bother coming to their vow renewal ceremony. He also mentioned that they'd been planning to let me stay in my old room during summer breaks from college, but now I'd have to figure something else out. I replied that I'd be staying with my grandma during breaks and wished them well with their ceremony. I also made it clear that my decision about the scholarship money was final. 2 days later, I got a long text from my mom. She said she had sacrificed her youth and career dreams to raise me, while my dad worked himself to the bone to support us. She thought the least I could do was help make their special day perfect. She ended by saying my grandfather would be disappointed in my selfishness. I didn't reply. Instead, I focused on getting ready for college. My grandma helped me buy stuff for my dorm and promised to drive me to campus on moving day. The night before I left for college, my parents showed up at my grandma's house without warning. My dad wanted to talk to me alone, but my grandma wouldn't leave the room. My mom started crying, saying they just wanted one perfect day to make up for past mistakes. My dad pointed out that $5,000 wasn't much compared to the $80,000 scholarship that would cover my tuition and expenses over 4 years. I told them again that the scholarship was for my education, and I wouldn't disrespect my grandfather's memory by using it for anything else. My dad called me stubborn and selfish, just like my grandfather. My mom said I clearly didn't care about their happiness. When I didn't give in, they left, with my dad slamming the door on the way out. The next day, my grandma drove me to college. As we unpacked in my dorm, she told me I'd made the right choice. She said my grandfather would be proud of me for standing my ground and honoring his wishes for the scholarship. During my first semester, my mom texted me now and then, mostly about their vow renewal plans. She never brought up the scholarship money directly, but sometimes hinted that they had to scale back their plans because of money issues. I kept my replies short and didn't engage with those comments. My dad hardly ever reached out, except to ask when I was coming home for Thanksgiving. When I told him I was spending the holiday with my grandma, he just replied, "Typical. Update 1. It's been around 5 months since I last posted. I just wrapped up my first semester at university and made the dean's list with a 3.8 GPA. My engineering classes were tough but really interesting, and I joined a robotics club that competes in regional tournaments. Last month, my parents went through with their vow renewal ceremony, but it was much smaller than they originally planned. I know this because they posted a ton of photos online. Instead of the fancy country club they wanted, they rented a small event space at a local hotel. The food was a buffet, not the fancy plated dinner they had talked about. About 30 people showed up, mostly coworkers from my mom's grocery store and some of my dad's construction friends. None of my grandparents, aunts, or uncles were there. When I stayed with my grandma over winter break, she showed me the photos. She mentioned that my mom had sent her an invitation last minute, but she chose not to go out of respect for me. I told her it wouldn't have bothered me if she went, but she said it was her decision. A few days into my break, my parents showed up at my grandma's house. They brought me a small Christmas gift, a fancy-looking watch. When I opened it, my dad pointed out it was the same brand my grandpa used to wear. My mom said they'd saved for months to buy it, even with the costs of the Vow Renewal. They stayed for about an hour, making awkward small talk about my classes and their jobs. As they were leaving, my mom hugged me and whispered that they'd put a deposit on a rental property as an investment, but were struggling to make the first mortgage payment. She hinted that any help I could give would just be a loan until the property started making money. I stepped back and told them straight up that I wouldn't be giving them money from my scholarship. My dad looked angry and started to say something, but my mom stopped him. They left without another word. That same evening, my grandma told me that my parents had been calling her for weeks, trying to get her to convince me to give them some of my scholarship money. She had refused every time, telling them that the money was meant for my education, not for them. She apologized for not telling me earlier, but she didn't want to upset me during my winter break. When I went back to university for my second semester, I felt a sense of relief. Being away from my parents made it easier to focus on my studies. I also started a part-time job working 10 hours a week to earn some extra spending money that wasn't tied to my scholarship. My mom kept sending me occasional texts, usually pictures of her and my dad doing everyday things like eating out or watching TV. She never directly asked for money, but sometimes she'd make comments about how they were cutting back or making sacrifices to get by. I'd reply politely but kept my messages short. My dad hardly ever reached out, except for a quick, "Happy birthday" text in February when I turned 19. When I thanked him, he didn't reply. Update 2. It's been 6 months since my last update. I finished my first year of college with a 3.85 GPA and landed a paid engineering internship for the summer at a company near my school. Since it's paid, I've been able to save some money on top of my scholarship. I decided not to go back to my hometown for the summer and instead rented a small apartment close to campus with a classmate who's also interning nearby. My grandma was cool about it and has already visited me twice. My parents, though, have been acting weird. After barely talking to me for months, they suddenly started calling and texting a lot when they found out I wasn't coming home for the summer. My mom said they were planning a family vacation to make up for all the drama over the past year, and my dad mentioned they'd been fixing up my old room, expecting me to stay there. When I told them I'd already signed a lease and committed to the internship, my dad accused me of avoiding them on purpose, and my mom suggested my grandma was influencing me because she's never liked her. I reminded them they'd told me before that I wasn't welcome at home unless I helped out financially, but they both denied ever saying that. Last month, they showed up at my apartment unannounced. They somehow got my address from a friend of mine, and my roommate let them in before I got back from work. When I walked in, they were sitting in the living room going through my textbooks. My mom had brought homemade food in Tupperware, and my dad was looking around the apartment, pointing out things that needed fixing. They stayed for 3 hours, and the whole time they kept bringing up how expensive their new rental property was. Apparently, the tenants had damaged some appliances, and they had to replace the water heater. My dad showed me pictures of the place on his phone, bragging about all the work he'd done himself to save money. My mom added that they'd maxed out 2 credit cards to pay for the repairs. Before they left, my mom hugged me and slipped a piece of paper into my hand. It had a bank account number and a note saying, "Anything you can spare would help." I gave it back to her and reminded her that my scholarship money is only for school. My dad just shook his head and mumbled something about me turning into one of those out-of-touch academic types. After they left, my roommate asked if my parents always acted like that. When I asked what he meant, he said they'd spent the whole time waiting for me talking about their money problems and even asked him if he knew how much my scholarship was. 2 weeks later, I got an email from the university's financial aid office. Someone had called them asking about the payment schedule for my scholarship, pretending to be me. When the office asked security questions to verify the caller's identity, they couldn't answer and hung up. The financial aid officer wanted to make sure it wasn't me and reminded me not to share my student ID or financial details with anyone. I had a strong feeling it was my parents, so I called my grandma to see if she'd heard from them. She told me they'd come by her place the weekend before, asking a bunch of questions about my grandfather's scholarship fund and whether there was any way to access more money for family emergencies. She kicked them out and tried calling me right after, but I was busy and missed her call. After talking to my grandma, I went to the financial aid office to explain what was going on. I asked how my scholarship was protected, and they told me the funds are sent directly to my student account for tuition and housing, with only the living stipend going into my personal bank account. They added extra security questions to my account and made a note that no changes could be made unless I showed up in person with ID. To be safe, I also opened a new bank account at a different bank, moved my savings over, and set it up so my stipend and internship payments would go there instead. I didn't tell my parents about any of this. A couple of days later, my mom called, sounding really upset. She said my dad had gotten hurt at work and needed surgery, but their insurance wouldn't cover all the costs. They needed $7,000 and didn't know where else to turn. I told her I was sorry to hear about my dad, but couldn't give them money from my scholarship. That's when she broke down and admitted they were the ones who'd called the financial aid office pretending to be me. She said they were desperate and knew I wouldn't help them otherwise. She promised they'd pay me back once their rental property started making money. I told my mom what they did was fraud and could have put my scholarship at risk. I also let her know I'd already taken steps to protect my accounts and warned that if they tried anything like that again, I'd have no choice but to take legal action. She started crying and handed the phone to my dad, who yelled at me for threatening my own parents and accused me of not caring about family. After that call, I blocked their numbers and emails. I reached out to a counselor at the university's student services office, and they helped me come up with a plan to move forward without staying in touch with my parents. Right now, I'm focusing on my internship and my studies. My grandma checks in on me regularly, and she even talked to some of my grandpa's old colleagues to make sure my scholarship is safe, no matter what my parents try to do.